The last 7 years of my life have been absolutely insane. But the real story is actually even crazier than the one I usually tell people. When people ask me about my life, I usually tell them a story about travel. How in early 2019, I blew up my life and moved to Southeast Asia and spent a few months on the ground in Thailand working with the UN, and then 10 months working with a local NGO in Cambodia. And it was awesome, and very much the experience I wanted to have, where I was really and truly immersed in a culture that was very different from mine, working on the ground with local people. And then the pandemic hit, and I was actually on the last plane that was allowed to transit through Taipei before they shut down the borders. Then in October 2020, my husband and I split up. I was working remotely and I didn't really need to be back in the States, but I couldn't leave. So I looked around and I was like, Puerto Rico's kind of like living abroad. So once again, I got on a plane, and less than 24 hours later, I had already decided to move there. And I spent 2 fantastic years, in many ways living the life I'd always wanted to live, where I was hiking up rivers and jumping off waterfalls and going to the beach almost every day. And I loved it. But what I'd really wanted this whole time, ever since those early days in Thailand, was to be a digital nomad. Someone who works remotely and travels around and doesn't really live anywhere. So I did. At the end of 2022, I, once again, got on a plane and spent 2 years having life-changing experiences every couple of weeks. I moved on average every 10 days and somehow managed to hit all 7 continents in 2 years without even really meaning to. And it was a phenomenal experience. I checked off everything on my bucket list by the age of 36. But by the end of it, I was exhausted. I ended up back in the States, and after all that time immersing myself in other people's cultures, spent a little time in some parts of the United States that were pretty different from where I grew up in California. That's the story I usually tell people. But this was never really a story about travel. It was always a story about reconstructing my life into the life that I actually wanted to live. It's a story about taking apart every piece of who I was and examining it and deciding what to put back, what needed to come in new, and what needed to be released. And I have let go of so many things over the last 7 years, chief among them anxiety and stress and fear that was holding me back from the life that I really wanted to live. And as I did all of that, I rediscovered a piece of myself that I hadn't even dared to put on my bucket list because I didn't think I could ever possibly have it. When I was a kid, what I wanted more than anything else in the world was to grow up, to travel around the world, learning about magic, how to do real magic, like Harry Potter kind of magic. And I had no idea that when I set foot on that plane 7 years ago, what I was really stepping into was a life where I would grow up to travel around the world learning about the real world equivalent of magic. And that is the story I most want to tell, because it's a story I haven't told to almost anyone, but it's the piece of the story that means the most to me. Because if there's anything I've learned on this journey, it's that anything is possible. Literally anything. All you have to do is figure out how to make it real for you. So what do I mean by all of that? Subscribe and join me on one hell of a roller coaster of a ride. This story I tell people starts in Southeast Asia, but my first step actually happened 3 years earlier, in March of 2016, during Semana Santa in San Lucas Toliman, Guatemala, because that was the best week of my life. And after that, there was no way that I wasn't going to live this life.